There is a place in the eastern Cape of South Africa where lush farm fields in a small valley slowly undulate their way into a massive field of dunes. Paardevlei. There are many legends and stories associated with these dunes. Once, a man disappeared in the area while paragliding, and 20 years later, someone traversing the dunes on a fishing trip saw a piece of parachute sticking out and stumbled upon his body. A number of people got stuck in vehicles over the years and left to go get help. By the time they returned, the dunes had moved and the cars were no more. The dunes are said to sing if the conditions are right. Legend has it that the dunes singing are the voices of those who got lost trying to traverse them. Around 2004, the area became part of a wildlife preserve and was closed off to the public. It happened for good reason, as there weren't limitations on vehicles entering the dunes, and folks would get up to less than nature-friendly things, from what I've heard. But the restriction of access completely was a heavy blow to those who grew up in the area, and is still a point of great contention to this day. I had visited where the dunes meet the ocean one time when I was very young. We'd driven out on the dune buggies my uncle built, and the adults had fished while I dug in the sand for hordes of oysters that lived beneath. This video is sponsored by you. The support this channel receives on Buy Me a Coffee and through print sales allow me to make videos like this, so if you enjoy things, please consider supporting the channel. About 15 years ago, my dad started talking about how he'd like to cross the dunes one last time. He grew up on a small farm in this tiny valley in the eastern Cape of South Africa. And at the end of the valley lies the field of dunes that stretches far off into the distance before meeting the ocean. My dad would walk from the farm to the ocean, stay there overnight fishing, and then walk back the next day with food for the next little while. The only potentially feasible way to get across them now is to walk them, but it's no easy task. As with most grand plans, the idea of a final dune crossing would come up every once in a while over the years, but the scope of the ordeal, finite time we spent that side of the world, and complexities of being able to enter the land would get in the way. For the last 5 years, we'd been actively trying to get access. The intricacies of South African bureaucracy are such that you can get different answers to the same question depending on who is answering them. For a number of years, we were told it was impossible. One year, we were told we needed the right permit. The following year, once we'd gotten the permit, the weather turned and we couldn't go on the permitted day. The next year, we returned and were told there was no such thing as a permit. This year, though, we'd gone in, applied for the permit, been given one, and decided not to ask questions regarding the variation of answers and just go do it. We set out at 4 a.m. My dad said the earlier we could go, the better, as the dunes are punishing in the harsh sun, so the less time we could spend out there in full daylight, the better. We drove an hour to the valley in the dark, and after traversing a field with no roads and some curious bulls, we arrived at the old entrance to the dunes. It was largely overgrown, but there was still a faint path one could follow. More of a path than there had been in the past, which makes me think either more people have gotten access, or it had turned into a game trail. It was covered in spider webs, so my dad ended up using a stick to smack the webs out of the way as we walked. The dune field may not look particularly vast from an elevated angle, and the fact that one can see the ocean from the peak of the first dune gives one a deceiving sense of optimism. The scale of this place is absurd, and once you start heading into it you realize it's really no joke. The sand pulls at you with every step, and the inclines are exhausting both on ascent and descent.
Gaan nie lekker wees om terug op te kom nie.
We could see our journey ahead of us though, and the majesty of the dunes in the dawn light was unparalleled. On the descent of that first dune, the sand was just hard enough to really interfere with grip, and it would have been a long way to slide down. There were no other footprints in this place, no other markings of traversal, Even the creatures of the area seemed to give it a wide berth, since the only spoor we rarely saw were some bird prints and some marks where a snake had lazily sailed its way along the border of the sand and bush. In the early morning, the sand and air were cool, and the walk was easy. There were more clouds than I would have liked that ended up blocking the dawn light, but on occasion they would break slightly and play with the dunes in interesting ways. This easy walk was not to last long though, because it was easy as a result of the dip we found ourselves in, and the dunes were slowly rising in the distance. I grew up following my dad on geological trips, and as has always been the case, he trailblazed ahead while I meandered on behind, looking at things. The sheer scale of everything around us had me mesmerized, although I was brought back to reality by the exertion every time we had to scale a dune. The silence I experienced in this place was absolutely surreal. Silence. There was nothing in the way of wind in the morning, and we were far enough away from any kind of civilization for the only sound to be that of our feet pulling through the sand, and eventually our own heartbeats in our ears. After a long while though, we reached the second to last dune in the field, and could hear and smell the ocean. We took a brief break to sit and look at the world, and after briefly pondering whether where we had made it to counted as an endpoint, continued on. There was an awareness throughout that, as tired as we were already, we still had to go all the way back. As we neared the ocean, my dad started telling me more about the excursions he'd gone on when he was younger, and how our endpoint was to be a place where someone had built a beach cabin to use as a base for their fishing excursions. A while later, we reached the ocean. As we got nearer though, something weird was happening on the horizon. It looked like the sand just suddenly turned into water. We were soon to realize why. Erosion had turned the meeting point of the dunes and the ocean into a sheer cliff. There was no way down to the water. In a way, not being able to reach the water felt like a blow, since it would have felt like a true end point of the hike. I could perhaps have dug in the sand for a while to see if there were still as many oysters. But the goal was not to accomplish a grand hike, or to find some oysters, but rather to complete a retracing of this somewhat mythical journey from my dad's childhood. We meandered the edge of this new cliff, wondering if there might be some way down, and eventually came to a point where there was a slight incline along the edge. This, my dad said, is where Wim Julius's beach cabin had been. There was nothing there now, besides shrubbery and maybe an indent in the dune. It made me melancholy to think of the stories that had taken place around the area that there was nothing left of now. But I photographed the cabin's location, and we continued on. In the far distance, we could see a place where the dunes truly blended into the ocean, with no cliff. It was too far away to walk now, given our tiredness, but it was somewhat reassuring to know that the phenomenon still existed, along the coast at least. We sat for a while and caught our breath and ate a breakfast of egg mayo sandwiches, and then started heading back. There were a lot more stops on the way back. The sun had gotten harsh and the sand was warming up. We decided to try a different route too, to avoid some of the worst inclines, which worked out in some cases, but was more difficult in others. As we walked, I could see the only other two sets of footprints in the dune field. The set that belonged to us, walking towards the ocean. As we traversed the fields, my dad showed me geological phenomena and explained how one could read the conditions of the prevailing winds over the airs through these fossilized dunes. It always felt a bit like magic to me, the way he can read a landscape, and often these fascinating stories written in the stone make for nice photographs too. We trudged along for hours, watching the shadows on the dunes disappear, and started to succumb to exhaustion more and more frequently. By the time we reached the dune at the start of the field again, the sand was properly warm, and traversing the steep and still slippery dune was just as tiresome and tricky as it had been on the way in. We stopped frequently to look back at what we had traversed, and marvelled at how different the field looked in the midday light. When we reached the top of the first dune, there was elation and a bit of sadness, because we were uncertain when, or even if, we'd ever be back there. As we traversed the final decline to the meadow below, the sand had reached a scalding temperature, and I rushed to find spots of shade to stand in. The sand sung to us in a low hum for the first time on this final push as our feet sunk into the cooking dune and disturbed its rest. A massive thank you to everyone who supported the channel in the past and made this journey possible. Special thanks to the members on Buy Me a Coffee who provide what is technically my only consistent form of income and allow me to buy film and fuel for videos like these.